So I know we've been talking about interfaces in the sense of an interface element inside of our PHP code, but now let's talk about public interfaces or APIs. Now, one of the things that object-oriented programming really allows us to do is to be more specific about how we expect other people to use our code. If you compare this with procedural code, we have very little control over what people are doing with our functions. So if you look at the code in our first step, I'm just going to open up the first step here again so we can take a look at it. These are all of the functions. We've got build form, we have validate form, submit form, and so on. Each of these are separate entities, which means that somebody can use them however it is that they want. There's no limitation on it. If someone wants to use submit form on something that's not really a form, but just because they find some useful code in there, they can do that, no problem. The issues arise when we refactor this code and then we end up breaking somebody else's code, or we end up breaking our own code because we were using this function in ways we didn't anticipate at the start. And the idea is that at some point, every application gets complicated enough where this becomes a real problem. It becomes harder and harder to refactor things because you just don't know what they're going to impact. And because with procedural code, it's very hard to create automated tests for everything. We haven't talked about testing yet, but we will get to that in a little bit. But suffice to say that objects can be a lot easier to test than functions are. Well, what is it about objects that help us define this public interface? Well, if we compare these functions in this procedural code with what we currently have with our classes, you can see that the functions that we call belong to an object. So we would assume that build should only be used in the context of this form object. Same with validate, same with submit. So it becomes clear that there's a relationship between them. Because the constructor takes the settings that are used throughout all of the different methods, that further defines the relationship between all of these methods, because we can't use them independently of the class. So simply constructing your code into objects makes a lot of those relationships more explicit and less likely for other people to use the code in ways that weren't intended. Also in our code, we've specified which methods can be called without an instance. So if we scroll down to the validator class, then you can see that we have functions that are meant to be called outside of an instance because they have the static variable specified. So this further defines our public interface. This says that these can be used independently. So even though this defining of our public interface happens sort of automatically, there are things that we can do to further tighten it down. And it helps to realize that every piece of code that you build is actually an API whether you realize it or not. You have to think about it in terms of how other people might use it, or in how you might use it down the road. Even if you don't think about it that way, it will come up at some point. So it's better to be aware of it as you're building your code, instead of having to come back in later and refactor everything to make sure you know exactly what you're exposing to other parts of the project.